Welcome, everybody. Good evening. It's only 8:50. I have 10 minutes until I get started. I didn't realize that it was going to go live as soon as I click the button, but here we are. So 10-minute warning as I get everything settled. It's extremely hot and very, very humid where I am here in New York. And so I don't know if there's audio interference from this giant fan that I have running over here, but I have a big fan running because otherwise I may suffocate and certainly will sweat all over the place. So I do apologize if there is any audio interference, but that's probably the best I'm going to be able to do. If it's bad, I'll turn it off and then you can all just watch me sweat. So, that's how that'll go. But in any event, we're at the 10-minute mark. It's 8:50 on the East Coast in the United States. I will be starting at 9 p.m., so just about 9 minutes from now. And I have a ton of information. There is so much going on, and it's clear that a lot of people have stopped paying attention to Ukraine. So allow me to help keep people up to date on what's going on. So for those of you who are already tuned in, thanks. It's going to be a few more minutes until we get started and I figure out how this is all supposed to work and whether or not I'm going to actually see people's chats and so forth. So we shall see. I'm still relatively new to using this particular software that is streaming live directly to YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and to Twitch. So please forgive me as I try to get on this learning curve on how to use the software, to use it effectively, and to be able to manage 4 different streams at the same time. I'm not the smartest person in the world when it comes to software and things of that nature. So still working out the kinks. Hopefully people are seeing this and hopefully people are going to feel able to communicate. So, and again, for those of you who are tuning in, it is extremely hot where I am right now, so I have a fan running. Hopefully that's not going to create an audio problem, but we shall see. Also, if you hear any screaming children in the background, that is because it is almost 9 o'clock and my children have not yet fallen asleep, which is a nightmare, a living nightmare, and yet that's how it is. So anyway, I am somewhat small talking here for the next 7 minutes while people hopefully join the stream. And I will be following the comments, the chat to the extent that I can. Anybody who wants to drop any comments in there, you're welcome to. I will just note that I'm doing these streams nowadays, hopefully once a week. But I will say that for those of you who do not subscribe on Patreon, there are exclusive streams of this kind that are going to be just for the patrons over there. So in any event, if you're interested in that, I'll obviously plug it several times here, but that's where you can go for all of these type of streams and so forth. Somebody's asking for a hug. Not sure, but I'm sending you a hug anyway. Not sure who that is. There you go. I'm sending you a hug. I just sent you a hug. Okay. So let's see, 8:54. Absolutely. Well, Russian invasion, not Ukraine war. That was a comment that somebody posted on YouTube. I agree. It of course is, but it's a war. It's a war in Ukraine, but it's a war launched by Russia's invasion and Russia's seemingly endless stream of war crimes that continue on every single day. We're going to talk about a lot of all of that. So just wait. I have about 6 more minutes until I get started on this stream. And again, for those of you filtering in, thank you, of course, for being here, for listening, for being interested in these issues. And if you do like the kind of information analysis I put out this evening, please do consider going over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Dritzer. I have a lot of stuff there that is exclusive just for those who are subscribing. So please do consider that, and I do appreciate that. Hopefully everybody is doing okay. Hopefully everybody is staying cool. As I've mentioned several times, I have a fan going because it's extremely hot and humid where I am here in New York, and hopefully that's not creating any audio problems in the background. I don't think it is, but in any event, let's just quickly do a preview of what I'm going to be talking about here this evening in case you didn't see like the what do you want to call it, table of contents or whatever about what it is I'm going to be talking about. I have a bunch of subjects. We're going to talk about Zelensky's purge of Ukraine's security services. That was big news today. The other big news today, Putin's trip to Tehran, where he met with Turkish President Erdogan and Iranian President Raisi. We'll talk about that, what the implications are of that. Germany, as it relates to Europe's support for Ukraine, tensions between the Russian military and its Wagner mercenaries, Russian airplane and aerospace problems that they're having, the reality of Donbass, an excellent article that was written by a Facebook friend of mine that I want to talk about and give a little bit of attention to, what Donbass was really like, how Donbass really came to be what it is today, and certainly not Russia's propaganda about it. Russia conducting cultural genocide in Ukraine, that is absolutely happening, and that is absolutely worthy of careful discussion, which I will do. Ukrainian POWs being tortured by the Russians, that goes without saying, and we now have very detailed firsthand accounts of that. I'll briefly talk about, I won't spend too much time, but I will talk about the shameful, absolutely shameful silence from many leftists on the fact that Russia is conducting this kind of torture, the fact that many of these leftists talked endlessly about Abu Ghraib and the US, the CIA, the US military torturing people in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere, and absolute silence when it comes to Russia conducting similar types of torture. Russia's top female tennis player coming out as LGBTQ and condemning the war. That was big news today. Russian lies about the missile strike on Vinnytsia. I'm going to talk about that. Very important to understand how they manipulated that narrative. Russia's mass abduction of Ukrainians, an absolutely ghastly atrocity that needs to be discussed. Russian anti-war journalist detained. Prospects for peace. I'll talk about that. Several other issues as well. So that's that. That's what we're going to be talking about this evening. I have 8:57 on the clock, so we'll be starting in just a couple of minutes, and yeah, so we'll be touching on all of those subjects and maybe others. If you want to drop a comment in the chat, feel free to do that. Please do. I will try, if people are going to send questions, I will try to answer them to the extent that I can, as much time as I have. But we'll see. We'll see how it goes. I have a lot of stuff to cover. So in any event, hopefully everybody is doing well. Everybody is staying cool. It's obviously horrendous in Britain, in Europe. It's not particularly pleasant on the East Coast of the United States right now, but I guess I'm not going to complain. So yeah, that's that. All right. So let's see. What time do we have? 8:58. 2 more minutes. We'll get started. I'm going to try to start right on 9 o'clock on the dot, because as always, people's time is important and I don't want to waste people's time. I'm obviously vamping here, trying to make it to 9 o'clock. So in a sense, I am wasting your time if you're already watching me, but we will get started here in just a minute. And yes, 1 second. Let me just had to send a quick message to my wife before we get started here, because I'm not going to do that in the middle of the stream. So hope everybody is doing okay. Thank you for joining me this evening. Just going to get started here in about a minute or so. So yes, and again, I will just one more time here before I get started. If you like this work, patreon.com/Eric Draitser. I know I'm shamelessly plugging it, but I want everybody, or as many people as possible, to see all of these videos, and some of them are only for subscribers. So that is where you can go, and that is how you will get access to all of that. Now, I don't actually. I wish I knew how to. Boy, I wish I knew how to work this well enough to know how to get the link for the YouTube live stream. Okay, I'm not sure how to do that. Let's see if I can figure that out here on the fly. That would be nice. I think I may be able to do this. Live streaming. Let's see. No, I guess not. I guess not. Oh, well, that was a little ambitious of me, but I guess I'll have to figure that out by talking to someone who knows what the hell they're doing. All right, we are just a few seconds out from 9 o'clock, and we will get started. Again, thank you to everybody who's joining me. There's so much to to cover, so much to discuss. Obviously, people who are in Ukraine and in the region, they have so much more to worry about in terms of what's going on this evening, what's going on with their loved ones, etc. But for those of us who are lucky enough to not be in a war zone, who are lucky enough to not be under constant bombardment, we do have, in my view, a responsibility and obligation to not only pay attention to these things, but to help people understand what is happening, to cut through a lot of propaganda, both Russian and NATO propaganda, and to also identify, well, what is really happening? How do we understand what's happening in Ukraine? So anyway, I have 9 o'clock. We're going to get started here. Thank you to everybody who's joining me, and hopefully others will filter in as time goes on. I want to just quickly introduce myself. If this is the first time you're watching the video, my name is Eric Draitser. I'm the host of Counterpunch Radio, which is a podcast that I produce in partnership with the great left-wing publication Counterpunch. My videos and audio commentaries and poetry and all that other stuff that I put out, it also available on Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitser. Go to Counterpunch to get the free podcast. Go to Counterpunch to subscribe to CP Plus. Go to Patreon if you want to subscribe to all of my other videos and everything. Okay, let's jump into the news here. So much to discuss. Let's start with some international news. Well, it's all international for those of us in the US, of course, but international meeting here is very important. Putin in Tehran meeting with Turkish President Erdogan and Iranian President Raisi. So I'm not going to get into all of the possible details of everything that they covered, but let's just broadly look at some of the key categories, issues on the agenda, as it were. Obviously, one of the critical ones, most important with regard to the 3 countries and the last 5 or 6 years, is the question of Syria. All 3 countries have been directly involved in the conflict in Syria. Obviously, Russia intervening on the side of Bashar al-Assad and his government, Iran intervening on the side of the Assad government using its various militias that it was sponsoring. And then, of course, we also had a lot of other players that were sort of sponsoring the anti-Assad forces, whether they were the fighters in the early part of the conflict or whether they were some of the criminal gangs that ended up taking over in terms of the anti-Assad fight. In any event, all of these countries, Iran, Russia, and Turkey, are directly involved in the conflict in various ways. So Erdogan has a very clear agenda with regard to meeting Putin and meeting the Iranian leadership. And there's several different reasons why it's so important for Erdogan. With regard to Syria, Erdogan is looking for a tacit, if not an overt, green light to conduct his own special military operation, to use Russia's despicable phrasing for this, special military operation in northern Syria. Obviously, we're talking about attacking and or displacing and ethnically cleansing the Kurds of northern Syria, ending the project of Rojava, sort of putting an end to the, I guess you could say, the last 10 or so years of relative Kurdish autonomy in northern Syria. Remember that Erdogan and the Turkish government sees the Kurds as a big problem for them, and they use the cover of the PKK, which they regard as a terrorist organization, as a sort of a blanket, a sort of an umbrella term to describe all Kurds. Turkey wants to more or less eradicate the Kurds. Now, that may mean actually killing them. That may mean simply displacing them, dispersing them among the population of Syria elsewhere in the country, dispersing them to other countries with a Kurdish diaspora, whatever it may be. But ultimately, Turkey wants to clear northern Syria of the Kurds. This is one of the reasons why Turkey, even today, just before meeting with Putin, Erdogan and the Turks made it very clear that they're still willing to freeze NATO accession for Finland and Sweden over this Kurdish issue. Again, trying to leverage the best possible deal they can get out of NATO on the one hand, and also out of the Iranians and Russia on the other hand. Again, we have to keep in mind that Iran opposed Turkey's moves in Syria. This was one of the main sources of friction, one of a number of sources of friction between Turkey and Iran over the last decade or so. And in fact, that aspect of this needs to be understood because it is more than just geopolitical concerns. It is more than just, sort of global strategic interests or what have you. It is also very clearly about economics, about money, about propping up the Turkish economy. As of 2012, trade between Turkey and Iran was roughly 21 billion US dollars. By the end of 2020, it was roughly 1 billion US dollars. Now it's jumped back up to about 5.5 billion in 2021, but still way off of what it was 10 years ago. So what that tells you again is that Turkey has economic interests to normalize its relations with Iran. Turkey needs Iran as a trading partner. Turkey wants tourism, not just from countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia, but really all of the Muslim world. And Turkey has been facing very significant economic hardship, including inflation that far outstrips the inflation we see in Europe and the United States, including questions about the stability of its currency, stability of its economic system broadly. So Turkey is looking to rebuild ties with neighbors, as I mentioned, of course, Iran, but also the Saudis and others. Now, the role of Assad and the Iranian militias now becomes a very real question for Erdogan. On the one hand, Erdogan has recently made moves to normalize with Assad, as he has with others. On the other hand, he has a very real question about just how much of a free hand Turkey is going to have in northern Syria with a newly assertive and sort of reconstituted Syrian government under Assad's control with Iran, given these tensions. So he needs Turkey and Erdogan, they need to clear the path for their desired cleansing, genocide, whatever you want to call it, against the Kurds. So that's a big aspect of all of this. Iran also sees several other trends, and Turkey does as well. For one, the Russians are moving their assets out of Syria, where they've been since 2015, obviously replenishing their forces in Ukraine. This then raises a number of other issues, including who fills the vacuum. Erdogan obviously sees an opportunity to fill something of a vacuum in Syria as the Russians exit. And all of this means that Turkey, Iran, and Russia have to get, at least to some degree, on the same page with these issues. Now, Russia, for its part, needs Turkish support on a number of issues. There's probably more than we can really even discuss here, but one has to do with Turkey's influence in certain areas that Russia sees as its quote unquote sphere of influence. As I would just remind people that before Russia invaded Ukraine, Russia intervened militarily in an uprising in Kazakhstan in January of this year. That was a workers' uprising in some of the oil producing parts of Kazakhstan that was ultimately crushed by the government of, well, Nazarbayev and Tokayev in Kazakhstan, but essentially really crushed by Putin and the Russian military. So then it raises the question, who really has influence in places like Kazakhstan? Is it the Russians who sent in their military, or is it a country like Turkey, which really has the much closer ties culturally, has much closer linguistic ties, it has financial ties, and really Turkey, not Russia and not China, but Turkey is seen as the positive alternative in those former Soviet republics of Central Asia. Putin's got a very real credibility problem in these places. The Russian government, the Russian military is very strongly disliked in a lot of those places, and especially in places like Kazakhstan. Similarly for the Chinese, Turkey is the one that has much more goodwill. And so for this reason, among many others, Putin needs to play ball with Erdogan. Russia also needs help from Turkey with regard to normalizing, or at least pressuring the Europeans to normalize, both away from the sanctions, but also to normalize a host of issues, including technology exchange, including issues related to trade in the Black Sea and elsewhere. This is a very significant issue for the Russians, and it's also a very significant issue for Turkey. Turkey has its own problems in the region, including the fact that Turkey's become more assertive in recent years, and that has turned much of the region against it. I would remind people that Turkey made a lot of moves to extract gas out of the Black Sea and out of the Eastern Mediterranean, and those gas deposits, which are considered some of the world's best untapped reserves, those raised the eyebrows in Israel, in Egypt, in Greece, in all of the countries littoral of the Eastern Mediterranean, but also raised the eyebrows of the Russians when Turkey started prospecting for gas in the Black Sea. So there are a number of maritime questions that Turkey and Russia have to work out, including just how they're going to divide up influence in places like the Black Sea, Eastern Mediterranean, and elsewhere. There's also the question of drones. This has come up in several contexts in the last few days, one having to do with the news that Iran, another party of these talks, Iran is shipping significant numbers of drones. I think it was in the range of 400 drones to the Russians to set, as part of a massive sale of this drone technology. On the other hand, it is Turkish drones that have proved themselves on the battlefield in recent years. Remember, Turkey militarily intervened in Libya. Turkey militarily intervened in Nagorno-Karabakh on the side of Azerbaijan against Russia's ally Armenia. Turkey's also intervened in a number of other conflicts, or actually, I shouldn't say intervened in a number of conflicts, but they have sold their drones to a number of other belligerents in conflict, including in Ethiopia, including to their bases in Somalia and to the government in Somalia and elsewhere. So Turkey's Bayraktar drones, which are one of their primary exports, these have played a critical role in Ukraine. Now, just today, we saw a headline out of Turkish press saying that the owner of the company producing those Bayraktar drones has said never under any circumstances will those drones be sold to Russia. And at the very same time, the Iranians are selling their drones to Russia, drones that were reverse engineered from US drones. So there's multiple levels of sort of geopolitical and economic conflict happening here, all of which need to sort of be ironed out, at least to some degree, between these countries, because all three, Turkey, Iran, and Russia, have a vested interest in dialogue amongst themselves that cuts out the United States, the British, the French, the European Union, etc. This is a major multilateral sort of, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? Multilateral format. Now, of course, grain is also a big part of this. Everybody's talking about Ukrainian wheat, the Russians having more or less blockaded Ukrainian ports, or the ports that they don't already control or haven't already destroyed, like Mariupol, for example. So this question of negotiating the transit of these wheat exports is only one part of the broader question of whether or not Turkey can play intermediary in sort of, I guess, cajoling Putin into allowing these shipments to happen. But the question really comes back to, is Turkey a partner for the Europeans, or is Turkey a partner for Russia, or is Turkey simply playing both sides as they have for decades? That was historically the role that Turkey played throughout the Cold War, the sort of crossroads between East and West, NATO partner on the one hand, but close ties to the Soviets on the other hand, all throughout that period. And in many ways, Turkey continues to play that role. And again, with the drones and the wheat and other issues, we see that coming to fruition. Now, at the same time that Putin goes to the region to meet with the Turkish president and the Iranian president, Biden had gone to the region and met with the Israeli government and MBS, the Saudi crown prince. Now, this tells you a little bit more about the alignment in the region, because we've seen moves by the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, and by Saudi Arabia to kind of sort of maintain something of a neutral stance on all of this, neutral to the extent possible. That is to say, still within the U.S. sort of imperial camp, but at the same time continuing to do business with the Russians. Just today, we saw a report that the Russians are using Emirati currency, not dollars, but Emirates currency, to conduct some of this trade for oil that they've been doing, and then I guess using the Emirati currency, converting that into dollars, and then doing the business that way. To the extent that that's true, this again indicates the complexity of the position of some of these Gulf states. Biden was there to try to make sure that they all stay within the U.S. camp. It seems like that he had some mixed success to that extent. Now, we have to also keep in mind that the United States is not simply trying to whip them into line to support the U.S. They also want to make sure that all of these countries understand that they are not to be aiding the Russians in evading these sanctions. And that's exactly what's happening. So the US Treasury, by putting these sanctions on the Russians, have essentially forced these countries to make a choice. And most of those countries, at least from the outlook, from the looks of things, most of those countries are refusing to make that choice. Now, we have another area where Russia and Turkey seem to be coinciding, and that has to do with the rights of women and the rights of LGBTQ people. What I mean is that the Russians, years ago now, I guess it was like 5 or 6 years ago, the Russians did not take part and did not become signatories to what's known as the Istanbul Convention, or the Istanbul Convention on the Rights of Women. That treaty, which was signed by, I believe, almost every country in Europe and many other countries internationally, that treaty was to enshrine the rights of women, the rights of LGBTQ minorities throughout the European space, and throughout those countries that wanted to be seen as, to whatever extent, progressive enough to sort of be considered part of the European community, however you want to call it. Now, the Turks did sign on to this agreement. Hell, it was it was held in Istanbul. It's called the Istanbul Convention. The Russians refused, and we've seen Russia going in the exact opposite direction, legalizing domestic violence against women, relaxing laws and penalties for men who abuse their wives, for all manner of crimes against women. The same holds true for the rights of LGBTQ people in Russia, laws against sort of propagandizing, in other words, speaking openly about sexuality, about issues of sexuality and gender, etc. All of this has more or less been criminalized in Russia since 2017, and especially now in 2022, where Russia is leaning very hard into this sort of right-wing reactionary culture war on, sort of the West as progressive and anti-family, and Russia as the great defender of traditional morals, traditional morality, and the traditional family. Well, guess what? That plays pretty nicely, pretty well in a lot of the world outside of Europe and the United States and North America. In a lot of parts of the world, that is seen as very much common sense. And in fact, it seems that Turkey is now moving in that direction. The ruling party, that's Erdogan's party, has announced that they themselves are exiting out of the Istanbul Convention, just like Russia. They are rejecting what you might call Western liberal values, which is interesting because as a member of NATO, they play such a central role in European security, at least, in the context of NATO and US imperialism. So this is a very interesting development. As Turkey becomes more and more important to the Europeans, Turkey moves further away from European so-called values and closer to Russian, conservative values. So it again raises the question of what exactly is Turkey's position in all of this. Okay, I could go on for a long time on that issue, but we have to move on because there's so much to discuss. So keeping with this idea of the international relations side of this, we need to talk about Germany and how Germany fits into this broader question of just how long is Europe going to continue supporting Ukraine. For my Ukrainian friends, this is a matter of life and death. This is an existential question. Without external support, Ukraine basically is crushed by the Russians, unable to fight off the Russians, to slow their advances, etc. So if we concede that Europe and the United States to an extent too, but Europe especially really is the lifeline for Ukraine. That then raises the question of is Europe able to continue doing that if Germany is not on board? Germany is the economic engine of Europe. Germany is seen to a large extent as, at least in theory, providing the sort of political leadership for Europe. We remember back to Angela Merkel's handling of the Greek debt crisis and the Troika and the European Central Bank, and keeping Europe together in the midst of the post-2008-2009 economic crisis. So Germany is supposed to really play this central role, and yet it seems that Germany is wavering on this question, depending on how you look at it, of course, but Germany is not totally sold one way or another. Now, there are real worries in Germany, and I could talk about a number of different ones, but we should just be blunt and honest about it. The primary issue is energy prices. Germany cannot continue functioning economically if it doesn't produce its export output, its automobiles, its high technology, these type of things that it both uses domestically, but most importantly for export. Without the gas to run, to generate the electricity to run those factories, the German economy is risking potential shutdown and collapse. Now, that has obvious ramifications in the German ruling class, which is made up to a large extent of a lot of these industrial interests. I mean, the world's largest chemicals company is in Germany, BASF. Some of the world's largest technology companies, auto manufacturers, etc. Those are German companies that are at very serious risk here. So according to the most recent numbers, the cost of energy as of today in Germany has doubled from where it was a year ago. And the forecast is that it will likely triple by the time all of this is said and done. That raises the question of, are the Russians even going to allow Nord Stream 1, that gas pipeline under the Baltic? Are they going to even allow that to come back online? And if they don't, what is Germany going to do? As of now, storage facilities in Germany, storage facilities for gas are at about 65% capacity. The estimate is that by December, they will be at 90% capacity. In other words, the Germans are not going to be able to just buy more and more gas as they need it. They cannot store it. They won't have enough facilities, and it takes a tremendous amount of time to build new facilities, both new facilities for traditional gas storage, but also that LNG, liquefied natural gas, which the United States and other countries are very keen to export to Europe, but require their own specialized facilities for taking that in and storing it. So in any event, Germany is very much between a rock and a hard place. Now, there are political divides, and I will just say I don't claim to be an expert on German politics. There are others who could speak to that, people who know Germany much better than I do. But at a very basic level, there seem to be divides between Olaf Scholz, the chancellor, and his party, the party of the center right, and also conflict with the center left in the form of the German Green Party, among others. So I would just highlight Robert Habeck, the Minister for Economics and Climate, and he has called for Germans to use less energy. Right? Notice the difference here between what Habeck of the Greens is saying and what Olaf Scholz, the chancellor and the representative of the ruling party, is saying. Very different. The Greens are saying we need to make sacrifices, we need to consume less, we need to do all of these things in order to punish the Russians. Scholz, and behind him, of course, German business interests, are more talking about doing what they need to do to get the Russians to bring Nord Stream back online, doing what they need to do to move towards some degree of normalization. In other words, they are scared. They are very scared that they are going to be the ones who are held accountable for the collapse of the German economy when the energy is shut off. And I think from a political perspective, one can certainly understand why they would think that way. So I mentioned that Nord Stream 1, interesting side story about that. The German government had actually recently persuaded the Canadian government to return an essential turbine for the Nord Stream 1. The Canadians were servicing and repairing this turbine. I guess it was under some kind of a contract with Siemens, but in any event, they were at one point not going to return the turbine basically keeping Nord Stream 1 offline, which would be devastating to the Germans. The German government got involved, convinced them to send it back. Now, of course, Putin holds all the cards because he's got his turbine, and he's still not necessarily going to turn Nord Stream back on. So again, Putin has a tremendous amount of leverage when it comes to Germany and energy, and of course he knows that, and for that reason, Putin and the Russian government and its propaganda apparatus are doing everything they can to stoke the public fear in Germany. They want the public to be terrified of what a winter is going to look like without Russian energy. They need them scared, because the more scared the German people are, the less likely they are to be steadfastly behind Ukraine, and the more likely they are to immediately agitate for an end to the war. An end to the war, from Putin's perspective, means an end to the war on Russia's terms, on Putin's terms. So there is a sort of an economic what's the word I'm looking for? An economic strategy, for lack of a better word, from the Russians to squeeze Germany and to squeeze Europe to the extent that they can. The Russians are counting on war fatigue, and they're probably correct to do so. War fatigue absolutely is a very real issue in Europe. It's already begun to set in. We see that in terms of the divides among some of the political elites in Europe, both in Germany, but also we've seen that in France. We've seen that in Italy between Draghi and other ministers in the government, in France between Macron and former President Sarkozy and others who have chimed in publicly. So there's clearly very significant divides, and that's exactly what Putin is trying to foment, as to the extent that he can. For a long time, and this is important, for a long time, Germany really did kind of sort of have the best of both worlds. It could kind of export its economic policy, trade policy, and to some extent political governance to the European Union. Germany didn't have to be leading all of Europe because there was this EU, the European Union, and Germany sort of delegated a lot of what you might call its natural European responsibilities to the EU, while simultaneously pursuing sweetheart deals with the Russians. Don't forget, many German industrialists, German investors, and others made tremendous fortunes off the Russians and Russian gas sales to Germany. They had a vested interest in making their own side deals with the Kremlin, irrespective of what the EU wanted. It's part of the reason why it's been, for a long time, so extremely difficult to even conceive of getting Germany to move away from Russian gas and energy. So this is now created it's sort of put an end to that best of both worlds scenario for Germany. Germany now essentially has to choose. Will it continue getting this cheap energy from the Russians and continue with the status quo, thereby allowing the Russians tacitly to continue their war in Ukraine? Or does Germany take a hardline stance, cut the Russians out completely, put an end to the sweetheart deal, and go their own way, at least go their own way, meaning go away from Russia and more towards Europe and the United States? That divide, that sort of dilemma is really at the center of a lot of the conflict in Germany right now. NATO, for its part, NATO apparatchiks, those that write in the various U.S. pro-U.S. think tanks and elsewhere, they're all talking about the desperate need for German leadership. NATO forces and the U.S. strategic planners, they call for German leadership. But what does that really mean? That means not taking necessarily into account Germany's own self-interest, not taking into account the interests of its economy, and more taking into account Germany's place politically within Europe. The United States would love to see Germany leading Europe by the nose, gung-ho behind Ukraine, but it's not working like that. The conflicts are too deep, the contradictions too long-standing, and something is going to have to give with respect to Germany. Okay, I'm going to have to move on from that one and just talk a little bit about what's going on in Ukraine politically, because I talked a little bit about the international side of this, but the Ukraine piece needs to be discussed because a major shakeup has happened today. I'm sure if you're watching me, you're probably already following the news on a daily basis, but maybe not. Big news this week was a major purge by Zelensky himself of some of the top leadership, including those that he directly appointed. Now, a lot A lot has been written about this. We could probably read into it. I wouldn't speculate too deeply about what may or may not be happening behind the scenes. There's, I'm sure, all kinds of political intrigue going on there. But what we can see from the outside, from what's been reported, this is a major political purge. The SBU, that's the Ukrainian Security Services, the SBU chief, Ivan Bakanov, dismissed. The prosecutor general, Irina Venediktova, also dismissed. The deputy director of the SBU, so the number two to Bakanov, Volodymyr Horbenko, also dismissed. And along with him, a number of other regional chiefs. So basically, the entire top leadership, or much of the top leadership of the Ukrainian security services, is now gone, dismissed from their posts. Now, it's not entirely clear what will happen to them. It seems like these are not people that are suspected of collaborating with the Russians, and more sort of being targeted for perceived, maybe real incompetence, inability to control their branches of the government, whatever. In any event, there was a no confidence vote presented by Zelensky to the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada. It was approved by an overwhelming majority. These individuals have now been dismissed. Now, it's been said that they're going to be reassigned to other posts, but the real question is why? What is this about? Now, a lot of reporting has already come out about the fact that Zelensky, apparently, at least according to the reporting, blamed Bakanov, that is his longtime friend who he appointed to head the security services, that he blamed Bakanov for failing to root out the Russian spies and Russian collaborators within his own department, within his own security services. And that, at least according to Zelensky, is what led to a large extent to the successes that Russia had in the first few days and weeks of the war. The attempted blitzkrieg by Russia, which ultimately stalled, but which was successful in places like Kherson and elsewhere, that was laid at the feet of Bakanov, maybe fairly, maybe unfairly. It's not entirely clear. But in any event, Zelensky certainly blames them for this. Now, what do we read from this? Is this just a political purge? Is there more to it? Does this indicate a disorganization and potential chaos at the top echelons of the Ukrainian government? I don't know that we can necessarily read that far into it, because there may be other reasons, other factors at play. But what we can say, though, is that at least according to Zelensky's own party, that the leader of his own party, that's the Servant of the People Party, a guy named David Arahamia, says that new information has come to light and that more purges are coming. What does this mean? We'll have to wait and see. Do they have evidence of people at high levels in the Ukrainian government collaborating with the Russians? If so, we would probably see a little bit more public outrage over this, public evidence being disclosed to the public. I don't know yet, but it's certainly in the middle of this war, for him to have purged some of his closest, top leadership and potentially close advisors. I think this tells you that, at least from Zelensky's perspective, there's very real trouble in terms of leadership on the Ukrainian side. Now, Zelensky has already said that over 60 former SBU are now working with the Russians in Russian-occupied territory. Now, again, comparatively speaking, is 60 a big number? I don't know. It's hard to say based on not knowing the total number in the SBU broadly, but it sounds like a lot of people inside of the security services are working, at least working with, or maybe even working directly for the Russians now. So if I were a Ukrainian, I would certainly be paying attention to that and be keeping my ear to the ground, because I guarantee you people on the ground in Ukraine could tell you a lot about the rumors that are flying around what caused this shakeup. All right, let's move on here a little bit and talk about Ukrainian POWs, prisoners of war. I've already mentioned this briefly, but I will just talk a little bit about torture here, because as somebody from the United States and whose politics was really forged in anti-war activism against U.S. atrocities in Iraq, I mean, the entire war was a crime against humanity and an atrocity of epic proportions. Fighting against all of these things, learning how to be an activist in opposing the war, in opposing the Bush administration, in opposing everything that they were doing post 9/11, it became a core principle for me that under no circumstances was I ever going to be silent about torture and crimes against humanity, these kinds of atrocities. Now, the reason I say that is because we all know sections of the left that are absolutely silent over the crimes against humanity that the Russians have been conducting. They have all sorts of reasons for how they justify the mental gymnastics that they go through to come up with ways to absolve the Russians of guilt, oftentimes just ignoring the news completely. Well, guess what? The Russians are torturing Ukrainian POWs on a massive scale. We now have very clear evidence of that, including firsthand testimony, including all of the forensic evidence from Bucha and everywhere else. Now, obviously, Russia's propagandists say all of this is lies. Everything is Ukrainian lies. The Russians would never in a million years commit such atrocities. Well, all of the overwhelming evidence points to the fact that not only are they committing these atrocities, they are doing it in a systematic way as part of the campaign. Now, let's talk a little bit about some of the information we've learned from these POWs. We had several POWs that have given their testimony. This was published in Open Democracy. By the way, I'll just note, all of the stories that I'm talking about here, I will include the links for in the descriptions. I guess if you're watching, depending on where you're watching, YouTube or Facebook, you go to the description and you can find all the links. I'll put them in there afterwards. Anyway, these prisoners of war, they were returned in prisoner exchanges. Ukrainian officials, now I say this with a grain of salt because Ukraine is a belligerent in this war. Obviously, Ukraine is the country that was invaded. They have their own perspectives. They have their own numbers, their own sources, etc. So take with a grain of salt, I suppose, Ukrainian officials, but Ukrainian officials' claim was 7,000 military personnel and 1,500 civilians that have been abducted, kidnapped, tortured, whatever, by the Russians. Now, the detainees are usually held in prisons that are close to the Russian border, places like Kursk and Rostov and the Bryansk regions. Those are some of the most popular destinations for these Ukrainian POWs. We have very little information about just how many there might be because the SBU, just like their FSB counterparts, they don't share these details. Families of the POWs get very, very little information as well. So what we can learn is what comes directly from those who have survived this ordeal. So one of the young men highlighted was a Ukrainian soldier named, actually not a soldier, sorry. The other one was a soldier. This was a Ukrainian worker named Sasha Chernyak, who spent the first days of the war in his office. This is in the Kiev suburbs. Okay, remember, just think back to the first days of the war. The Russians attempted to sort of blitzkrieg the entire country. They pushed all the way to the Kiev suburbs. That's, of course, where we had the atrocities at Bucha, among others. And it was at this time, in late February, early March, when the Russians had moved into those suburbs, that this guy, Sasha, was abducted. Well, I guess you could say taken prisoner. On February 28th, he walks home. This is 4 days after the invasion. He walks home, attempts to get home. He's abducted by the Russians. He's beaten, tied, blindfolded, and interrogated repeatedly, day after day after day. He is accused by the Russians of being a spotter, that is to say, somebody who would relay targeting information to the Ukrainians, who would then target whatever that location was. He is repeatedly accused of being a spotter. Obviously, this is what they suspect him of, or at least they claimed this is what they suspected him of. He's taken to a military base. According to him, he's interrogated 3 or 4 times a day. One of the phrases they use, and this is interesting to tell you how the soldiers are thinking about this, they keep saying, "Are you a Bandera? Are you a Bandera? Are you a Nazi?" Right? To them, using the word, the name Bandera as a sort of a means of ridiculing Ukrainians, without getting into the historic legacy of Bandera, just understanding that it's become a slur against Ukrainians by the Russians. And by the way, everybody, everybody on both sides of this war has slurs for the other side, but the dehumanization is critical because dehumanization is part and parcel of torture. It's very difficult to torture people that you see as human beings. You have to dehumanize them, see them as less than human, as animals or worse, in order to be able to mentally justify the kind of treatment that they are meting out. So anyway, so Chernyak is taken. He's taken prisoner. He's ultimately taken and tortured in Kursk. Now the description is very interesting. He describes two guys, one with a boxing glove and one with a taser. Obviously, constant beatings, punching him in the gut, asking him to, spill the secrets or whatever they suspected of him. The taser, repeatedly tasing him in the neck and in the rib cage, what he describes as 22 beds, with men ranging in ages from 18 to 72. Constant daily humiliation in the form of beatings, forcing him to and other prisoners to kneel, to sing the Russian national anthem, and to sing songs dedicated to Vladimir Putin. Again, I think we could probably point to a number of historic parallels to this. The most obvious being the treatment of prisoners by Nazis in World War II. Very similar in terms of the kind of mistreatment, but not exclusive, of course, to the Nazis or to Russians today. The U.S. is guilty of just very similar atrocities, both recently in the war on terror, going back to Vietnam. In essence, this is really a fundamental aspect of war, this kind of torture, these sorts of crimes against humanity. And believe it or not, there are people on the left in the United States who bend over backwards every single day to deflect attention away from Russia's ghastly atrocities. But make no mistake, these are atrocities. They're happening every single day, and the Russians are 100% culpable for all of them and deserve to be, brought to the Hague on these sorts of charges, along with George W. Bush and so many others. So the other POW that was highlighted in this piece is a guy named Danilo Melnik. He was a chief platoon sergeant who was captured in early March. He was severely injured in the battle at Dmitrivka, which is, again, one of the Kiev suburbs. He was suspected of being a NATO soldier, suspected by the Russians of being a NATO soldier because of his uniform and the Javelin missiles that he had with him. Well, he was transported first to Belarus and then to a hospital in Rilsk, and then a hospital in Kursk. The Ukrainians in Russian captivity is what I meant to say. The Ukrainians in Russian captivity are not real people. And what I mean by that is they don't fall under any legally recognized category by the Russians. In other words, they are non-existent. They don't have to be treated according to Russian law. They don't have to be treated according to any kind of formal status. They have no formal status, and because of that, they ultimately have no rights. This is important because even Russian lawyers who go to try to provide some kind of defense, they're unable to even access these detainees who are pulled out of Ukraine. That's besides being a contravention of the Geneva Convention and basic human rights. I think it's a fundamental part of how Russia is operating in this conflict. Why do I bring all of this up about torture? Because we have to keep in mind the reality of this war. This is not a war happening on paper. These are real people who are having their kneecaps busted, who are having gun barrels put into their mouths, threats of machine guns up their rear ends, and so forth. So we need to keep a savage picture of this savage and brutal war. All right. Moving on, this is related to the POW issue. This is the mass abduction of Ukrainian civilians. The Russians, if you think it's bad that they're capturing and torturing Ukrainian partisans, Ukrainian fighters, how much worse is it to imagine that they're abducting by the thousands Ukrainian civilians, including women and especially children? There are almost no words to describe the level of horror to imagine your child being abducted from you by a hostile enemy that has invaded your country and then disappears your child into God knows what kind of an adoption system. That's what's happening. Let's talk about it very quickly. Kidnapping and abduction, this is happening. It is real. The Russians continue to deny it, but no matter. This is now well understood and well documented. There are people in Ukraine who have already escaped from these abductions, who have described what's happened to them. There's even something like an underground railroad that is helping people get out of Russia and back to Ukraine. So don't believe Russia's, the Kremlin propagandists who tell you that this is nothing but NATO and Western lies. Oh no, it is very real. It is happening, and it is monstrous. So the kidnapping and the abduction is actually something that the Russians have quite a bit of experience with. Let's take a look at 1944. 500,000 Chechens forcibly deported by Stalin and the Soviet government after Stalin accused the Chechen minority of collaborating and conspiring with the Nazis. Sounds familiar. First-hand accounts of abduction and torture and forcible deportation. This is happening over and over again. We are getting these accounts. And by the way, I should just note, the mass abduction and deportation of Chechens is not the only example of that, lest we forget the Tatars of Crimea or many other ethnic minorities in Russia that have at various times in history faced similar kinds of repression. So let's also keep in mind that, at least according to the United States, now the United States is a vicious monster of its own that we absolutely cannot trust. So with that said, we have to take with a grain of salt these numbers, but they are numbers nonetheless. According to the U.S. Department of State and the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, forcible extraction of roughly 1 million Ukrainians, with 260,000 minors having gone missing. Now, let's just assume the United States are nothing but a pack of bloody liars, which they are, and let's take that number and cut it in half, just to be conservative. Is 500,000 Ukrainians abducted and 130,000 children missing, is that somehow less of an atrocity? Hell, let's not even cut it in half. Let's take 10%. Let's say that the United States inflated the number by 900% or whatever it might be. You're telling me 100,000 Ukrainians abducted, kidnapped, forcibly deported into Russia, with 25,000 children separated permanently from their families. This is not an atrocity? Of course it's an atrocity, irrespective of what the numbers are. Maybe the U.S. is totally lying about the numbers. Who cares? It's an absolute crime against humanity. It makes me very upset to think about, because I think about my own children and how I would feel if somebody invaded my home and stole my children and sent them to a foreign country and made sure that I would never see them again. How would that make you feel? Would you be calling for blood? I would be. What's the point? Why are the Russians just cruel and vicious monsters down to their DNA with no rational thought? Of course not. They have absolutely rational, they're monstrous, but rational reasons for doing this. There are several. One has to do with and I'm going to return to this in just a minute, but the forcible erasure of Ukraine and Ukrainian identity as distinct and sovereign and distinct from Russia. The idea that Ukraine is not Russia, and that Ukrainian people are not Russians, and that Ukrainian culture is not Russian culture, that is unacceptable to Putin and the imperial revanchists in the Kremlin. They cannot accept that Ukraine is independent. They cannot accept that Ukraine is sovereign. And part of the way that they destroy that sovereignty and destroy that independence is by quite literally stealing their children and stealing their identity, taking it away from their children, indoctrinating their children to understand themselves to be Russian, not Ukrainian, to understand their history as Russian history, not Ukrainian history, and so forth. You get the idea. So one of it is the erasure of Ukrainian identity, but the other is very practical from the Russian perspective. They have a demographic catastrophe brewing in Russia, and it has been for decades. They have a decrease in total population from the 1990s, a decrease of roughly 2 million. They have a brain drain ever since 1991, where every highly talented and highly, well, I don't say every, but many highly talented and educated Russians simply leave the country. They go to Europe, they go to the United States, they go wherever they go to live better lives. And so the Russians have had this crisis. How do we replace the old and the dying and those who have fled the country? How do we replace them? Well, I would say 250,000 young Ukrainians who can be brainwashed into believing they're Russians can go a long way to helping some of those demographic challenges. That's part of this. We also need to understand the annihilation of Ukrainian culture and language. The further you remove a child from their language, the more likely they are to forget that language and to assimilate into whatever the mother tongue or lingua franca might be, in this case, obviously Russian. Steal their language, steal their culture, and turn them into Russians. That's what's happening here. All right. I got to move on to another related story. This is, well, I mean, it's part and parcel of. I didn't even use the word. Let me be very clear about what this is. This is a form of genocide. Okay, genocide is not just people being marched into concentration camps and mass executions. That's obviously an aspect of genocide, or a form that genocide can take. Obviously, the Holocaust and many other genocides, Rwanda and elsewhere, that we could point to. But the issue here is that that's not the only way that genocide is conducted. You can also conduct genocide by annihilating a culture, stealing the cultural heritage, destroying the cultural heritage, displacing an entire people, scattering them to the wind. This is also genocide, and that is the kind of genocide that the Russians are pursuing and conducting in Ukraine. So another element of this, it's not just the physical stealing of children, it is also the brainwashing of children still in Ukraine. We have a story from Russia sending hundreds of teachers to Ukraine to offer a, quote, corrected education. Isn't that interesting? Again, as I said, this is more cultural genocide. According to the Washington Post, which broke the story today, they are reporting roughly 250 teachers in Russia have already signed up. Now, when I say signed up, I mean they are being enticed with extremely lucrative packages, talking about orders of magnitude higher salaries than what they make at home, maybe 5 times more, 10 times more, 50 times more in terms of salary, the kind of enticements that become extremely appealing to people who, although they may be educated, don't live, a life of opulence or even affluence. Most teachers in Russia are ordinary working class, maybe lower middle class people, and for them, this might be somewhat appealing. All right. The curriculum, what's going to be in this Russian-approved, Russian-imported curriculum for Ukraine? First, obviously, this is all part of the cultural genocide. They will destroy Ukrainian historical narratives. Ukraine is not allowed to speak of its own history in its own way. Ukraine must understand history according to Russia's version of history, some of which is accurate, obviously, and some of which is grossly inaccurate. Distortions, lies, propaganda, etc. Again, in the United States, I have a master's degree in education. I used to be a teacher. I know perfectly well just how successful education can be in indoctrinating children to think however you want them to think. If you want Ukrainian children to grow up having separated themselves emotionally and psychologically from their own Ukrainian heritage, the best way to do that is to control the curriculum. And by the way, the fascists in the United States understand that perfectly. That's why these Trump scum are running for every school board position in every town and municipality and county and state in the country. Whether it's a blue state or a red state, Democrat or Republican, the right-wing fascists want to control the school boards because they want to control the information, because they want to indoctrinate and to push forward their agenda through the next generations. And the Russians are doing exactly the same thing. So the Russian version of history is one aspect of this. The suppression of Ukrainian language instruction. This is another one that actually has a deep historical resonance and memory for a lot of people in Ukraine. My family is a perfect example of that. My father grew up in Odessa, not really learning Ukrainian, speaking Russian, understanding Russian, Russian version of events, the Russian version of history, not because he was dumb, not because he was indoctrinated or whatever, but because that is how the Soviet government ran Ukraine. Ukrainian language was in theory supposed to have some degree of primacy in Ukraine with Russian as a secondary language, but it didn't quite work like that. Especially in the big cities, places like Kyiv and Odessa and elsewhere, Russian was the common language. Ukrainian was, to a large extent, suppressed, looked down upon, oftentimes ridiculed, condescended to, etc. Just like we have in the United States with indigenous languages historically and what have you, right? This is an element of chauvinism, in this case, great Russian chauvinism, historical and current. All right, and the other aspect of this, Russian textbooks eliminating Ukraine as a sovereign state. Ukraine doesn't exist, children. Boys and girls, come and listen very carefully as I tell you the story of a fake country called Ukraine that never really existed, just a bunch of lying Jews and Bolsheviks who made it up in 1917, never really existed. Actually, it's part of Russia. That's the kind of narrative that's going to be drilled into the heads of these children that are forced to swallow this Russian propaganda. All right. This is, again, part of a broader campaign to control Ukrainian territories. Basically, more or less, first, they're going to do the legal side of this, and that is fast-tracking citizenship and passports to the Ukrainians that are living in Russian-controlled territories. It's the surefire way to turn a Ukrainian territory into a Russian territory. All you do is just leave the people there and make them into Russian citizens. That's what's happening. They're fast-tracking passport applications, fast-tracking citizenship status for Ukrainians in these occupied territories. And then second way that they're doing this is actually coercing agreements, coercing agreements out of those Ukrainians that have gone through the so-called filtration camps, which are, these sort of abduction sites or however you want to think about them. But they're basically coerced into signing agreements stipulating that they will not return to Ukraine. Oops, sorry, you signed this contract, you're Russian now. And the last is the most, brutal of all, and that's simply confiscating passports. When the Russians don't abduct and fast-track citizenship, they'll simply steal your passport, dump you in Russia, steal your passport. Good luck trying to make it out. All right, got to move on. Running out of time here. It's already, oh my God, it's already 10 o'clock. I've been going for an hour. I still have a number of stories to cover. I don't know if you all paid attention in the last few days, but there was another, among an endless series of Russian war crimes, there was yet another war crime the other day when the Russians fired a missile directly into the city center in one of the major cities in Ukraine, in the city of Vinnytsia. So I already did a video on that. So if you want to go back and look at that video, please do. Again, the Patreon is where you can go find all of that, patreon.com/Eric Draitser. But I bring it up again because it's important that we examine carefully Russia's counter narrative, what they say happened, well, what we think happened, what the Russians say happened, and how we need to understand that. So the immediate reports were that, again, Russian indiscriminate firing into a major city that is way, way, way beyond the front lines of the war, right? So directly targeting the city center of a major city, that is clearly and unmistakably a war crime. Just the facts on the ground, at least 23 killed. The number may be higher, including at least 3 children. I don't even want to conjure up the image of the stroller that was overturned with the body of a 4-year-old, but just the worst possible things imaginable. In any event, that Zelensky stood there, did his video, said, yet another terrorist act by a terrorist state of Russia and a war crime, and calling on, Europe to condemn, et cetera, et cetera. Now, why do I bring this up? Because the Russian Ministry of Defense released its own narrative of what happened, and they obviously dispute this idea that this was an indiscriminate shelling or something, an indiscriminate missile fire, that the Russians weren't targeting something specific. In fact, the Russians are claiming that they did target something very specific. They say they targeted a meeting between Ukrainian Air Force officials and foreign arms dealers who are in Vinnytsia to essentially negotiate several different things, including the transfer of aircraft, including weapons, and also organizing to repair many of the damaged Ukrainian military assets, including their jets. So that's what the Russians claim. And they say they said that they targeted the garrison officer's house in Vinnytsia. And now, if you are, and this is what the Russians count on, you're just a regular person somewhere else in the world, and you hear that the Russians say, well, yeah, we targeted a military meeting and it was in the house of the officers, or the garrison officer's house. Makes sense. Why wouldn't you think a military meeting would be happening in a building that is quite literally named a military building, the garrison officer's house? Well, it turns out a day later, we hear from people who live in Vinnytsia and who know this area that actually it's called the House of Officers, and the building is not a military building, but it is a concert venue. And one of the people killed was a sound engineer who was preparing for a concert that was to happen that night. This is now like a week ago, almost. So what can we say about this story? Well, the fact of the matter is we can't say for certain. I don't know. There could always be a clandestine meeting happening in a building somewhere. But how do I want to put this? What's more likely, that the Russians directly and successfully targeted a meeting between arms dealers and Ukrainian military officials and successfully carried out the strike, eliminated all of the people that were involved, and made every effort to minimize civilian casualties, as they stated, or that they made a mistake? According to people who follow these issues, the Russians may have simply made a mistake and targeted a building that they thought was a military building, but that actually wasn't. Now, you can say that I always think the worst of what the Russians are doing. And so obviously I'm going to believe that the Russians made a mistake, and it's entirely possible that they're telling the truth. Yes, that is possible. The Russians are telling the truth. That is possible. But I have followed this war every single day from the day that it started, and actually years before that, I've been following this conflict. And every single day, we get lie after lie after lie after lie from the Russian Ministry of Defense. Bucha never really happened. It was a hoax, and the Ukrainians actually killed 900 people. The Mariupol theater bombing was a hoax, and actually it was the Azov Nazis that carried it out. On and on and on, Russian lie after lie. So, with that known, do we believe that all of a sudden now the Russians are telling the truth? Or what I think is far more likely, that the Russians made a mistake and targeted a building that they thought was a military building and actually wasn't? Locals are disputing what the Russian Ministry of Defense is saying. The most likely explanation was that it was a mistake in targeting by Russia, and then of course, when that becomes known, the Russians do what they do. They muddy the water. They release as much information as possible, a number of plausible or implausible scenarios. This is what they did with MH17 in 2014. This is what they've done countless times. As I mentioned already, the Mariupol theater bombing is a perfect example. And by the way, yet another example of fake-ass leftists in the United States and elsewhere who bend over backwards to say that the Russians are telling the truth, the Ukrainians are always lying. And guess what? All of those times that supposedly all of these things were hoaxes, all of them have proven to be accurate and true. Bucha was an unspeakable atrocity carried out by the Russians. The theater bombing in Mariupol was not carried out by the Azov battalion. Zero evidence for either of those explanations. So please, please, please identify those people that continue to spread Russia's bullshit lies. All right, let's move on. I want to talk a little bit about Russian aerospace industry because this is a crisis, and most people probably wouldn't think of it, but it is a real crisis for Russia. Russian planes are stuck. They're stuck without the parts. The Western planes, of which the Russian fleet is almost entirely made up of Airbus and Boeing planes, they are falling apart because they simply cannot replace the parts, and they cannot bring the technicians to do the work to actually replace those parts. So there are now major, major concerns over safety with regard to planes flying in and out of Russia. Russian planes and others. Remember that Russia has its own planes. Russia also leases planes from other governments, other manufacturers and their governments. And so this is a big problem. By the end of May, so what are we talking? 6 weeks ago, by the end of May, the Russians had 876 commercial aircraft in their fleet. Now, just for reference, when the war began in late February, they had 968, so they're down almost 100 airplanes. Okay, that might not seem like a lot, but that's a huge chunk of their overall fleet. Most of those planes, as I mentioned, those are Boeing and Airbus planes, and neither of those countries are willing to work with the Russians. Both of them are careful to observe those sanctions and don't want to run afoul of the U.S. government or the Europeans. Let's see. What are the parts? What are the parts that are most critical? The first and foremost is wheels and tires. The wheels and tires are needed because they basically have to be swapped out every couple of months. Think about when you watch a plane land and think about the kind of friction that goes on when those wheels touch the ground, the burning of the rubber and so forth, right? All of that tells you just how important those tires are. And the Russians cannot get spare tires. They cannot simply manufacture them out of nowhere. They can't source replacements for them. So they are stuck. Same for the computer systems. The computer systems oftentimes are programmed to automatically shut down after a certain number of flight hours because those systems also have to be swapped out and replaced. We're talking about systems controlling aircraft engines. We're talking about systems for the auxiliary power. That's to power the air conditioning, the circulating the air in the plane, etc. Basic fundamental elements of air travel and of these airplanes. Russia, for its part, is an extremely capable country when it comes to aeronautics, aerospace, right? The Russians obviously have a space program. They have decades of experience with planes, with air travel, with manufacturing these things. But Soviet planes were always shit. The Russians always needed to look to Europe and to the United States to bring in the technicians, to bring in high quality parts, etc. So the Russians aren't just going to be able to materialize these things out of nowhere. Let's see. Russia. So Russia has widened authorization for companies that are legally allowed to service these airplanes. So that means that, just a handful of those companies were authorized previously. Now everybody with a monkey wrench is going to be allowed to do what they need to do to fix these airplanes. One can imagine the quality of the work suffering significantly as more and more poorly trained and under-equipped mechanics and engineers and others are basically sent to fix airplanes that they're not trained to do. Now, the obvious conclusion of all of this is potential for an air disaster, potential for a disaster of epic proportions, hundreds of people that will die when a plane falls out of the sky or whatever it might be. Obviously, I don't want to see something like that happen, but the more time that goes by and the more the Russians are unable to secure those spare parts and those technicians, the more likely that outcome becomes. The other aspect of this is that the Russians, in order to continue flying, they're now forced to cannibalize other planes that they have. So now, again, we have to keep in mind that there's an industry standard here, and there's a reason why you're not allowed to simply take a spare part from one plane and apply it to another plane. That it doesn't work that way. Every part is calibrated, specific models are calibrated, every repair is supposed to be extensively documented. All of those things keep those planes at what is internationally recognized standards. The minute you start swapping out these parts and replacing one part here and one part from another airplane over here, all of that goes out the window. Those planes are no longer certified to fly. They will not be insured, and they cannot be exchanged for planes or parts from another country. In other words, it is like permanently debilitating these planes. Right. So the Russians, for their part, don't have a lot of options, and that's what they're going to do. And the other option that they're going to pursue, though it takes time, the Russians have announced that they're going to be building an aircraft parts factory in the city of Kazan by next year, 2023. We shall see just how successful they will be in building that factory. By way of reference, on June 10th, on January 3rd, 2020, so, a year and a half ago, the Russians had something like 493 commercial aircraft flying on the day of January 3rd, 2020. That's flying around the world, 493 Russian aircraft. On June 10th, there were 179 Russian aircraft. That tells you just how much of a decline you're seeing in the Russian fleet. These planes are increasingly finding themselves in, hangars to be fixed or simply just taken out of circulation. Russians are having less and less options when it comes to flying. And then there's also other reasons for that. Coronavirus puts a damper on tourism and, restrictions, flight restrictions, etc. But to a large extent, it is a result of the collapse of the Russian aerospace industry because of the sanctions and everything else. All right, got to move on. Making some progress here, about 4 more stories that I want to cover. Here's a question. Well, the headline: is Russia's new Ukraine offensive already failing? So, as we know, the Russians have launched their, I guess you could say, second phase of their war on Ukraine in the form of the offensive in Donbass. They pulled back from some of the other regions where they were stretched thin and have sort of concentrated their forces in Donbass after what they called an operational pause. So, here's the thing about all of that. We see all of these war crimes, all of this shelling, all of this other stuff that's happening, and how it's been ratcheting up in recent days as the Russians have increased the intensity here. But has anybody noticed a significant advance by the Russians? I haven't. I follow this every single day, and I see no significant advances, very little territory gained by the Russians since they launched this new offensive. Now, is that because they're just firing for fun? Do they not want to take more territory, or is it that actually they're not able to? So, according to British intelligence says that Wagner mercenaries, that's again the Russian mercenary outfit that is run by Prigozhin, the oligarch who is best buddies with Putin. The Wagner mercenaries are now operating on the front lines in Ukraine, and actually they're filling a lot of the gaps that have been left by soldiers that have been killed. So the Russians are not necessarily able to replace every soldier that's killed with another soldier. Instead, they have to bring these mercenaries, these contract killers. Now, according to the British, Wagner mercenaries have played a central role in the fighting in Donbass, including in the capture of the towns of Popasna and Lysychansk. Now, assuming that's true, and I think we probably should assume that that's true, this also raises another question. Where are they getting all of these mercenaries from? That brings us to some other excellent reporting from several news outlets about Wagner lowering their recruiting standards. Now, what does this mean? This means that, well, previous to this period, Wagner really only recruited battle-hardened professionals. I mean, real professionals. Now, some of them were Nazis and some of them, fascists, and some of them just, degenerate killers and various kinds. But for the most part, they weren't looking to recruit, the worst of the worst. They wanted professionals. Well, guess what? Now they're running out of bodies. And a lot of those professionals have come home to Russia in body bags, unacknowledged, of course, because they are strictly off the books fighters who don't figure into Russia's death toll or anything like that. But in reality, these are fighters that are being killed, and now they have to be replaced by increasingly convicts that are being recruited directly out of Russian prisons, including elderly veterans who have of battles from Afghanistan and elsewhere, and various others who were previously blacklisted. Who knows what that might mean? Rapists, pedophiles, gang members, mafioso, who knows, right? So again, Wagner was already a nasty outfit conducting atrocities all over the world. We should remember the several hundred people massacred in Mali a few months ago, the dozens massacred in Mozambique and Libya and elsewhere where Wagner has been operating. So keeping that in mind, this is getting worse. If you thought it couldn't get worse, it is getting worse. Wagner has taken heavy casualties. This much we know. Now, here's the most interesting aspect of this for me. This is the question of conflict between Wagner mercenaries on the one hand and Russian military on the other hand. And this is playing out at the highest levels. Putin recently made Prigozhin, the founder of the Wagner group, made Prigozhin a hero of the Russian Federation, bestowing upon him the highest civilian honor that can be bestowed. And at the same time, he's dismissing his generals, those that are not assassinated, of course. He's dismissing them. Now, what do you think that does to the mindset of people in the military leadership at the highest levels and even at the middle levels? They're certainly going to look sideways at Wagner. They're certainly going to be finding themselves increasingly either jealous on the one hand or distrusting of Wagner on the other hand. So the question really becomes, are we going to see a fracturing on the battlefield between Wagner forces and Russian military forces? There are some reports that that's already happened. Other reports that say that Wagner is kind of operating in the way that a criminal gang is operating, and that's probably, I'm sure, true. The final point on this is the question of mobilization. There was a lot of talk about whether the Russians were going to be forced because of their heavy losses to do a general mobilization. I think that's clear that they're not. But what does seem to be happening is something like a covert mobilization. So a covert mobilization to make up for these very heavy losses that the Russians have taken. Now, what does that mean? Well, it basically means not conducting a full-blown nationwide conscription process, but rather opening up new positions, new slots within the Russian military academies, Russian cadets, etc., to basically coerce or coax people into service, into leadership positions, and into these various training centers, right? And there obviously have various enticements, financial and otherwise. So my point here is that recruitment is happening at multiple levels. And despite the fact that the Russians are taking these heavy losses, they are in varying degrees able to replace them with more cannon fodder on the one hand, and also some of the worst human beings on the planet operating as mercenaries on the other. All right. Gotta keep moving here. I'm going to leave this question about Donbass until the very end. I want to talk a little bit about a Russian anti-war journalist we saw in the early days of the war, Marina Ovsyannikova. I'm trying to pronounce Ovsyannikova. She was prominent for having interrupted a live news broadcast with anti-war slogans on a sign. She was obviously removed. She's now sort of become probably the most recognizable Russian journalist in this period, somebody who's taken that public position. Anyway, she's now been detained again. There was video of her and photographs of her standing somewhere outside of the Kremlin with an anti-war sign. Now, I don't have it in front of me because I didn't print it out or whatever, but the sign read something to the effect of how much Putin is a killer, Russian military are fascists, and how many more children have to die before we stop this war, with a picture of a dead child. So again, this is awful. It's awful to think about, but it's a message that has to be heard. And she is obviously extremely courageous for doing that, knowing the potential repercussions facing her, including jail time for quote unquote discrediting the Russian armed forces. This is exactly what she was charged with. Fortunately, she was charged and released, though presumably there's going to be a court date, and presumably she's potentially going to face a hefty fine and or 15 days of jail time, or maybe more, depending on exactly what the charges will be. But the point here is that Russians are not entirely silent. This is at least one prominent Russian journalist that has been open about her opposition from within Russia. Now, how much more of that we can expect is anybody's guess. Unfortunately, many Russians have proven to be unwilling to speak openly for various reasons, obviously stiff penalties and potential blowback against their families, their loved ones, professional, their careers destroyed, etc. You get the idea. All right. I want to also talk about a positive story as well. And this also made headlines today. Russia's #1 female tennis player, Daria Kasatkina, has come out and revealed herself to be in a relationship with another prominent female athlete in Russia, Natalia Zabyako, who was a figure skating champion. So Kasatkina is extremely courageous. I have to say, extremely courageous to make this statement at this moment. I've already talked about how Russia has essentially criminalized the LGBTQ community. They have criminalized them in every way imaginable, from speaking about their lifestyles to propagandizing children, to even outward displays of affection to women can't be seen kissing in Russia or holding hands in Russia or anything like this. It is ghastly and awful, and it's difficult to even imagine that this is something that exists in 2022, and yet Russia has gone in that direction, this sort of conservative, right-wing, reactionary, kind of fascist view of human rights, of the rights of LGBTQ people, etc. Anyway, extremely courageous for her to make this statement. She's jeopardizing not only her own career, but she's jeopardizing her ability to come home. She lives, I believe, in Spain, which is not unusual for Russians who are, top-level athletes who train year-round and, are part of the international circuit. So the fact of the matter is she may not be able to come home, and I think she recognizes that. She cried in the interview she gave when she was asked that question, because I think it really resonates with her. She knows that she's in very real danger of not being able to go home. Now, the real issue here for me, and this is something that Kasatkina herself made clear in her statements, and again, I think she's 19, so this is an extremely courageous move by this very young athlete with her entire career and life ahead of her. She has come out and said that part of the reason why she did this was that she needed and wanted to be an example for other young LGBTQ people inside of Russia who aren't protected by being a world famous athlete with international status, who aren't protected with a vast network of friends and family in an international context, right? She knows that there are 15-year-old gay and lesbian and trans kids, youth in Russia who are terrified, who can't come out, who have to live their lives in the closet. And she wanted to be able to provide that emblem, that symbol of hope for them, and maybe to give them a little bit of courage to do it themselves. She even made that point very clear. I just want to give you one quote from Kasatkina. She says, quote, "Living in the closet is impossible. It is too hard. It is pointless. Living in peace with yourself is the only thing that matters, and fuck everyone else." That is about as blunt and true of a statement as she could have made. Congratulations, kudos are in order for her. This was an extremely courageous act by an extremely courageous young woman, and I think she should be recognized as such. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about Donbass now, and this question of the Russian minority in Donbass. This is a very important issue because it forms one of the primary talking points that the Russians use to justify this criminal war. They talk about it as a special military operation designed to protect Russians in Donbass, who they regard as being, a targeted minority, targeted by Ukraine. There is an element of truth to that, of course, and we could talk about that as well. But it is also an extreme distortion. So let's talk about this. This is I recommend a piece from a very, very excellent researcher in Kiev, Kiev based, and also in Germany. Her name is Yulia Abikok, and the article was, quote, "The Russian Minority in Donbass and the History of the Majority." Yulia is from Donetsk. She knows this history intimately. It is the history of her own family to a large extent, and this is an important history lesson for people who want to spout off about the war in Donbass, about Ukrainians targeting Russians and so forth. So this is a piece that I highly recommend. It begins by illustrating with a very clear example of what some of the so-called Russian minority in Donbass think about the war. It opens with a Russian woman in her mid-50s who immediately packs up to leave Donbass, saying that I am Russian and I will never live under them. In other words, knowing who they are and what they plan to do to this region. So in 2014, there was still a good amount of Soviet nostalgia in Donbass for various reasons that I'm going to explain. The Soviet period, especially the 60s and the 70s, is seen as sort of the glory days in Donbass, a golden time that people look back at with a tremendous amount of nostalgia and longing. Now, this is the narrative that was peddled by pretty much every prominent politician in eastern Ukraine since 1991. In other words, we have to return to the glory days. We have to go back to how things used to be when Donbass was, the engine of economic progress, when people's livelihoods were, sustainable and people were able to support their families and live comfortably, right? The idea that period had been lost because of Ukrainian independence, that then becomes very much a sort of a dominant narrative in the East that is peddled by a lot of these politicians who, for self-interested reasons, need to heap all blame for everything terrible onto Ukraine's central government in Kiev and onto the sort of anti-Russian forces. And those Eastern Ukrainian officials, including the oligarchs behind them, they saw their financial future as tied to Russia. Okay, so this tension between Donbass and the rest of Ukraine, driven by a lot of these politicians, this forms the sort of the core of this conflict. A lot of the unresolved issues stem from this narrative. Now, backing up a little bit, I think the article does a pretty good job of very quickly illustrating the complexity of understanding who these people are and where they come from. So Donbass, it should be understood, was pretty much undeveloped for centuries up until the point of Catherine the Great. We're talking the end of the 18th into the beginning of the 19th century. And Catherine the Great moves to resettle a number of peoples into what we now think of as Donbass for reasons of economic development. Christians from the Ottoman Empire formed a big chunk of those that were settled in Donbass, along with them Jews. That's my ancestors, my people from the Pale of Settlement, from places in the Polish-Lithuania, previously in the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, all through the Pale of Settlement from Vilna in Lithuania, modern-day Lithuania, down through Poland, Belarus, and all the way down into Ukraine, into Donbass. And similarly, also Greeks, especially in the seaport cities, and Serbs, as well as German settlers who were promised very rich agricultural, some of that fertile black earth soil of Ukraine. All of these different people from all of these different regions settled in Donbass, and that is at the, what are we talking, 200 plus years ago. Now go to the turn of the 20th century, 100 years later, you have the sort of what you might call the quasi-industrial revolution or industrialization of Russia. This is a brief period before World War I when Russia tried to catch up with the rest of Europe. And that period, the Russian industrial development, it brought poor Russians from all over the empire into Donbass because there were now jobs there, jobs in the brand new coal industry, jobs in the seaports, as I mentioned, and in the newly developing rail system, railways. Okay, so these sectors of the economy that were part of the development of Donbass, that's what attracted these settlers from all over Russia. That's who becomes the people of Donbass that we talk about today. So it is a combination of different peoples from different places with different histories that settled in that region. Okay, now the reason I bring all of this up is because it really puts the lie to the narrative from the Russians that, oh, well, these people of Donbass, these are just our Russian people. No, these are the people of Donbass that come from all sorts of different backgrounds and all sorts of different periods of time. Now, there is an additional wave of immigration to Donbass that forms the core of the period that we're talking about in the late Soviet period, and that is the post-World War II migration. You have a combination of political prisoners who are basically sent there as a kind of forced labor. You also have young communists who go there to take jobs in the coal industry, prisoners who are sent there basically to rebuild Donbass after destruction by the Nazis in the war. So you have these multiple waves of migration into Donbass that makes up the sort of, I guess you could say, the kind of kaleidoscope of the peoples of Donbass, all of whom more or less assimilate into this Russian-speaking region, this Russian-speaking character. Anyway, I mentioned the 60s and the 70s, the boom of the coal mining period. Now, the author of the article even mentions her own father, who is of mixed Belarusian and Ukrainian ancestry. And as a young person, he even stopped and ultimately forgot Ukrainian language and really assimilated, completely integrating into a Russian-speaking region in order to be able to, go along to get along. In other words, by sort of a almost natural, probably not the right word, but a sort of a natural, I guess you could say, process by which Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture is stripped away from the people in Donbass. So that, again, we have this sort of disconnect. Why do we see people of Donbass as so different from the rest of Ukraine? Well, we had these successive waves of migration coupled with the forcible repression of Ukrainian language and culture and heritage that I've already been talking about at the hands of the Russian imperialists first, and then the Soviet Union sort of continuing on with that legacy after having incorporated what Lenin correctly called Great Russian Chauvinism. So So in Soviet times, Ukrainian language was theoretically supposed to be the dominant majority language in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. But in actuality, it sort of wasn't. Ukrainian was a language that was recognized, a language that was spoken in villages, in small towns, in rural areas, and especially in the western part of the country. But in major cities like in Kiev and in Odessa and certainly in Donbass, places like Donetsk and Lugansk, Russian was the primary language, mainly the lingua franca, the language of education, the language of instruction, the language of business and commerce, the language of the official government. So, in other words, Ukrainian language became secondary, even though its technical legal status was primary. So, again, you have this sort of forced stripping away of Ukrainian culture and language. Now, coming to the post-Soviet period, and this is important for understanding the roots of the 2014 and current conflict, is that this question of what happened in the post-Soviet period. Donbass more or less collapses economically. It collapses for a number of reasons, but to put it very simply, the industry is hollowed out. Inflation is rampant, and it completely, devalues people's wages. It makes it impossible to make a living and forces a kind of, sort of a forced economic depression. And that also then couples with the reality of the 1990s, the early 1990s, and really throughout the 1990s in Ukraine, just as in Russia, in fact, and that is mafia wars, competing gangs, gangland killings, assassinations, dirty dealings of all kinds, human trafficking, weapons trafficking, drug trafficking, all of the usual stuff that the organized crime gets involved in. That became a huge part of daily life in Donetsk. And again, as I mentioned, the sort of hollowing out of industry, etc. What does this ultimately mean? It means humiliation for the people of Donbass. It means the sort of taking away of their dignity. And many of them, as I already mentioned, had their anger channeled, maybe sometimes correctly, often incorrectly, channeled to the central government in Kiev, channeled at the West, directed at those who were not Russian speaking, those who were pro-Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian language, or whatever, and now sort of made an ethnic conflict where there hadn't been an ethnic conflict. Ethnic isn't even the right word. It's sort of a national conflict or an ethno-national conflict, if you want to be sort of specific about it. This is a big part of this. The lack of dignity, the lack of respect to the working class of Donbass, to the miners and the rail workers and others, that then bred a kind of hostility to the central government in Kiev and to the ruling classes of Ukraine. That widened this rift further. And of course, in the background, the Russians are fomenting a lot of these conflicts. The Russians themselves are feeding a lot of these conflicts. And of course, they are supporting in various ways, sometimes overtly, mostly tacitly, supporting their preferred candidates, their preferred leaders. And that, of course, is what brings us to 2014, the Euromaidan uprising, and a pro-Russian government of Yanukovych versus the sort of pro-Western forces at Maidan. Anyway, I don't have time to recapitulate all of that, but the point that I want to make here is that when the Russians say that they are launching a war in Donbass to protect the Russians of Donbass, they're simply lying. The so-called Russians of Donbass aren't really a thing. There are Russian speakers. There are people who identify historically as coming from Russia. There are people who identify as Ukrainians, but who speak Russian, people who identify as all sorts of things, Greek and whatever else. The idea that these are Russian areas is false. This is Ukraine. and Russian culture and Russian language, along with Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian language, and Greek culture and language, and Islamic history and culture and so forth, all of that, and of course Jewish history and culture, all of that comes together in places like Odessa, but especially and in Donbass as well. So the point here is the Russians are lying when they frame the war in that way. And it's really important that we understand the history of Donbass in order to be able to debunk these pro-war narratives. And by the way, when you hear these assholes talk about, well, how come you were never speaking out about Ukraine killing 14,000 Russians in Donbass? First of all, that's a lie. That's not even close to the correct number. Secondly, and most importantly, the Russians simply made it up. They made up the idea that the people of Donbass are Russians. They are not. This is imperial revanchism yet again. The Russians do not see Donbass or any part of Ukraine as independent and sovereign. They see it as part of Russia. So why shouldn't they consider all of them to be Russians? All right. Last, I think I'm at the very end of what I have time for today. I'm my goodness, it's already past 10:30. Okay, last thing I want to talk about, and that's the question of peace. I'm not going to spend too long on that because this is a subject in and of itself that requires hours of discussion. But put very simply, from the very beginning, my position has always been advocating for peace. That is always my position when it comes to war. My politics are anti-war. I do not want to see escalations. I do not want to see more mothers mourning over their dead sons. I don't want to see more children being murdered. I don't want to see any of these things. Okay, I understand the nature of conflicts. I understand the importance of supporting a side that is fighting for its liberation, that is fighting against an invading army of occupiers. All of that is true. But we do have to keep our eyes on the question of peace because it affects all of us. So the question of peace really is an interesting one because my position has for a long time been that we need to be advocating for peace, and we need to be advocating for peace immediately because, quite frankly, it's the only option. It's the only option to avert more killing in Ukraine, and probably most importantly, it's the only option we have to avert what could potentially be a global catastrophe. I know that people don't want to think about the possibility of a wider war, but that possibility is very real, very real. We had threats from Belarus to bomb Poland. We've had threats from Russia to first strike nuclear capabilities, and on and on and on. All of these things. Please don't tell me it could never happen. Please don't tell me that's an impossibility. Please don't tell me that's a risk that you're willing to take. None of us are willing to take that risk because all of us have to continue to live, including my children who have hopefully 85 to 100 years of life ahead of them, hopefully. And I do not want to see the world coming to an end because the war in Ukraine spilled over into a nuclear conflict. Now, that being said, we have to ask strategically, what would peace mean and what would peace look like right now, and on whose terms, and who would benefit from peace right now? My feeling is that both sides would actually benefit from peace right now, and both sides are probably desperately needing peace. But I don't believe that Ukraine is able to move kind of leverage in this, in what would ultimately be some form of a negotiation. And right now they don't have that leverage. I would repeat the numbers. Zelensky himself provided numbers of 60 to 100 Ukrainian soldiers killed per day, with 500 per day wounded and taken off the battlefield. The New York Times estimates 100 to 200 Ukrainian soldiers killed per day. Just looking at raw numbers, it is simply unsustainable. It is impossible for the Ukrainians to continue at that level of losses on a daily basis. This is not to say that their sacrifices are not heroic or that they won't continue. They absolutely will. Every Ukrainian I've spoken to, every single Ukrainian I know, has absolutely zero interest in capitulating to Russia, zero interest in making concessions to the war criminal Putin or to any Russians, and certainly willing to continue the fight as long as necessary. However, with all of that said, just because there is a desire and a willingness to continue fighting, it doesn't mean that a capability to continue the fight is there, even with continued weapons shipments. The Russians are, for their part, able to replace their losses. This may be awful the way that they do it. They may be coercing and recruiting people from the poorest regions, pulling convicts out of prison and whatever they're doing, but they are able to replace some of their losses. The Ukrainians are not. So now it again raises the question, what would peace look like? Who benefits from it? Up until now, I would argue that the Ukrainians and the Russians probably benefit equally. Now, I'm not so sure. I think the Russians probably would benefit the most from a peace, and I'll tell you why. I think that the Russians would love to see a frozen conflict and a frozen line of demarcation, one that would enable them to regroup, reorganize their forces, resupply their people, buy some time, extend out the negotiations, and then choose a moment of their choosing to renew their attacks on Ukraine. This seems fairly likely, given Russia's history with freezing conflicts in places, not only in Donbass, but in places like Transnistria and with South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So the Russians know how to do this. And what it basically means is a ceasefire with a line of demarcation, a temporary ceasefire that could potentially be made into a permanent ceasefire. What does that ultimately mean? It means the Russians are going to be able to consolidate the territory that they have gained. If you have an immediate ceasefire, you then have the Russians permanently in control of places like Kherson and other regions that they have taken over. So does this mean that I want to see the war continue? No, it does not. But I also have to be sober in analyzing the situation and in understanding that at this point, given the losses and given the desperate desire by the Russians to move towards a normalization with Europe and with the United States, or some degree of normalization with Europe and the United States, it seems that Russia, not Ukraine, is the one that really needs the ceasefire right now. So it's complicated. I'm advocating, as always, for peace. I want the war to end immediately. However, I also understand that Russia advocating for peace might really just be is a cynical ploy by the Russians to buy time and to continue the war. So we're in a bad spot here, globally speaking, and specifically with Ukraine. We're in a bad spot where we need peace. We need to advocate for peace, but it can't be a peace that ultimately is a crushing defeat for Ukraine. It can't be a peace that demands every concession from Ukraine and no concessions from Russia. So I'm not sure. I wish I could end on a more hopeful note, but I do think that there is much more fighting to go until we get to the point where a negotiation can really happen. Now, there are several wild cards in that scenario, including a withdrawal of support for Ukraine. If Ukraine is now pushed by the Germans and others to come to the negotiating table and are being coerced to the negotiating table by having the weapons shipments and all of that other stuff cut back, well, that will change the equation. Or on the other hand, if Russia begins an economic collapse, that might force their hand. But until we see a drastic change in the calculus here, unfortunately, I think the war continues. Okay, that is all I'm going to be able to do for tonight. That was almost 2 hours. So if there are any questions, I don't see any here. I'm still working on how to effectively do. Oh my God, now I'm hearing that. Okay, so I'm going to have to leave. I guess I'm going to have to leave it there. All right, go over to my. Oh, I'm hearing my own voice here. All right, please go over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitser. That's where you can go to find all of my videos. I have so many. I'm doing several of these a week. If you like this sort of thing, detailed, whatever, please do go over there on the Patreon. And thank you for listening tonight. And I hope you all learned something, enjoyed it. And I will do another one probably next week. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.